So, good evening. I welcome all to Assure Academic Forum. So, myself, I am Dr. Rahul Srinivasan. I am one of the team member for covering the neurosurgery aspect. So, I'll be covering today on head injury. So, the main focus, the main two books which is important is one is the Greenberg, one is the Yeomans. So, Yeomans neurosurgical book is been considered as Bible for neurosurgeons, all neurosurgeons, whereas the other Greenberg is being considered as digest. So, but for entrance purposes, for fellowship entrances, and all in a nutshell, Greenberg is a very good book to go on and revise all your stuff before attempting the MCQs. Okay, I have Varun with me, so who will be simulating as a candidate. So, yeah, this is the first one of the 5 questions which I'm going to do today. So, the first question is, which of the following is not a component of Monro-Kelly doctrine? So, is it CSF? Is it meninges? Is it blood? Or is it brain parenchyma? So, Varun, you're there?
Sir, I
Yeah.
think it's meninges. Meninges is not a component.
Yeah. Why did you think of meninges?
Sir, because all CSF, blood, and brain parenchyma, all three of them take part together in Monro Kelly, whereas meninges is not part of it.
Okay.
Hmm.
So the basically it all depends upon the dynamics of the each component. So if you see CSF, blood and I mean the brain parenchyma, all are dynamic structures. So in which the most resistant is the brain parenchyma, and a very much resistant is the meninges. So meninges is just a component there; it is not going to be changing at all. Whereas if anything, if anything occurs inside a rigid box, it will either displace the CSF or the blood, and it will compress on the brain. So that's how the Monro-Kelly doctrine has been formed. So Monro-Kelly doctrine is nothing but it has been it's a principle which was evolved I mean 2 centuries ago. So basically, the Alexander Monro, who you know is the who told about the anatomical structure, the foramen of Monro. So he's the one who initially thought he came up. He's a physicist and an anatomist. He came up with an idea that skull is a rigid box, and you have a brain within it. You have a inlet which is through the arteries which supplies the blood. You have a outlet which is through the vein which carries out all the blood from the brain to the heart. So this was the principle behind the invention. So if you could see, I'll just first come how it was evolved. So Monroe was the one who has introduced this first, and then his own disciple Kelly, a student. So he has further told that the arterial system and the venous system is separate from the systemic organs. So if he has done a lot of autopsy studies showing that in a drowning patient and in a other systemic injury patients, he has shown that the brain it remains the same inside the rigid box, even the artery as well as the vein. So the Kelly has supported Monroe's principle. That's why it's called as Monro-Kelly doctrine. So this is the time when MRI and CT was not there. So they didn't think of CSF at all. So CSF was later discovered by what you say is by the Magendie, who you know the fourth ventricle, the medium foramen, the midline outlet of the fourth ventricle is been described by Magendie. He's an anatomist and physiologist. So he's the one who has told that there's one more component called as CSF, and this John Abercrombie is a pathologist who also supported the Monro-Kelly principle by he also been stating that there is some fluid inside the extra one more fluid which is there in the brain. So Cushing is the one who at last who is the Cushing is the one who is the modern father of the neurosurgery. He is the one who has told that it's the component. He has clubbed all this. So it is the component of CSF, the blood, as well as the brain parenchyma. It's all constant at one given a single time. At one single time, it's all constants. So that's how it was discovered. So it can be called as Monro-Kelly principle doctrine. It can be called as Monro-Abercrombie doctrine, or it can be called as modified Monro-Kelly principle. All means the same. The volume of CSF, the blood and brain parenchyma, is at a given point of time is being constant. So later, once the MRA developed, the Fishman is the one who introduced, who saw all this principle on the MRI, and that's how the by the radiologically the Monro-Kelly principle is supported. So now, if you come to the pathological states, so anything. So if you think as as a rigid box, so you have a two taps at either end. So you have a brain, you have the arterial system, you have the venous system of the brain, and you have the CSF component. So remember one thing: whenever something is being introduced into the component, like suppose you have a tumor inside or you have a bleed inside, the CSF is the most easiest to get displaced into the Virchow Robin space. So whenever you introduce a lesion or a bleed inside the brain in a rigid box, the CSF is the one which gets displaced easily. So CSF comes out, and the artery and vein still remains constant at that particular time. So it is just about a certain particular time the compensation occurs, and at a particular volume, the brain basically decompensates. So basically, the rise in bleed or increase in the bleed size or the increase in the tumor size will ultimately displace the blood and also cause ultimately displace the blood, and also it can cause compression over the brain, and that's how you get raised intracranial pressure. So this is the basics of all the intracranial pressure. So Monro-Kelly's principle is the basic you should know. So this is the most commonest question which has been asked in the MCQs. So same thing, you have blood in terms of blue color, and you have CSF in terms of white, and as well as your rose color, you have the brain. So as you introduce something mass inside the skull, so it up to a particular point it can compensate. After a particular point, it all displaces you can see how bad the blood component as well as the CSF component displaces, and there is a compression of the parenchyma. So this is the basic principle, but this principle is applied to all, like it is almost applicable to all except for this condition, because the skull of a pediatric child, the skull which is not closed, still there is the suture is there, but suture is not been fused. So this is the only exemption to this rule. So that's why the child pediatric still it can compensate for more rise in ICP compared to adults, and compared to young adults and children where the suture is already been closed. So pediatrically, this is the only one exclusion to the Monro-Kelly principle. Okay, this is my second question. Yeah, this is a 26 years old male or a female who comes to an ER following a road traffic accident. So patient, on evaluation, the patient opens his eyes on stimulation and on speaking and speaks inappropriate words and localizes pain with his right and as well as the left limb. So what is his GCS? So is it 8, 9 or 10 or 11? Yeah, Varun, you
Yes,
can
sir.
give it a
The patient's opening eye on stimulation, so E score becomes 2.
Okay.
He's speaking inappropriately, so verbal score is 3. And he's localizing pain with both right and left. So 5, motor score is 5. So 5 plus 3 plus 2 is his final
10.
score. Yes, sir.
Absolutely right. It's 10. So slide is okay. Yeah. So GCS is nothing but a Glasgow Coma Scale. Okay. Now Glasgow Coma Scale is nothing but a city in the Scotland, and basically it has been discovered by two neurosurgeons who wanted to invent something to actually communicate the neurological status of a patient. So they found it very difficult. There was no previous kind of communication between them. It was very difficult to communicate a patient status to other clinician. So that's why the neurosurgeons, Testdale and Janet, they had come with this GCS scoring. So it was, you could see this published in Lancet in 1974, one of the famous medical journals. Now you could see that GCS mainly has three parameters. So one is you look at the eyes, you look at the motor response, you look at the verbal response. So the maximum score you can get is 4. The verbal, the maximum score you can get is 5. The best motor response is 6. So so basically it has been divided accordingly. So eyes, like if a spontaneously patient can open, it is scored as 4. To speech it is 3. To pain it is 2, and no response is 1. So the minimum score in each of the component is 1. So minimum score a person can get in a GCS is 3, and the maximum score a person can get in a GCS is 15. So you could see same for the verbal response also. The maximum score is 5 for the verbal component. If he's confused and he speaks sentences, it's 4. And if he speaks only inappropriate words, as in our case, it's 3. And if he just moans or produces sounds, it is 2, and no response is 1. And for the motor response, if he localizes the pain, if he obeys to the command, it is 6. If he moves to the lower to the, he localizes the pain, it is 5. If he withdraws the pain, then it is 4. If he has an abnormal flexion, I'll tell you what it is 3. And if it is abnormal extension, decerebrate, that's 2, and no response is 1. So the minimum score is 3, the maximum score is 15. Now, a couple of limitations are there in this GCS. Some of the metabolic as well as some of the other condition which can affect this GCS. So it was not only discovered for just a head injury; it was whole for whole neurological purposes. So basically, even a hypoxemia or a hypotension or a hypoglycemia, all the metabolic causes, seizures, all can affect GCS in their own way. And any influence of toxic drugs as well as alcohol can also affect. And the verbal response is, if you could see on the right side, is more affected by the dental injuries, the maxillary, the mandibular injuries, as well as any injury to the speech apparatus, and any stroke or those kind of affecting the language areas specifically. So there you can have drastic worsening of verbal response in spite of maintaining the motor as well as the eye response. And of course, when the patient is being intubated, you denote T to the verbal response, because you can't assess the verbal assessment. You can also you can assess the verbal response when there is an airway. Also, you just put as T added to the T to the verbal V component. And when there is a NG tube, you can put as V. If the patient is just slurring, you can put as VNT. So there are various kind of things you can just add up to the GCS score to denote that something has been the response has been compromised due to something else. Okay, the GCS is almost common for all for more than 5 years, but there are the pediatric group, the GCS is slightly different. So it is mainly the verbal response, because the language, because of the developmental, the growth of the baby. So there are milestones, language milestones, which is there. So basically, the most important thing here I would recommend is to focus on this particular aspect, that is the verbal response for the less than 1 year child. So whenever spontaneously a child smiles or coos, you give it as 5. And whenever the child cry is inconsolable, so you give it as 4. And when there is inappropriate cry and you can't console it, you give it as 3. And when it just grunts and have some agitated and restless movements, you give it as 2, and no response is 1. So otherwise, almost rest of the thing is the same. It's just the language or the verbal component which is being slightly different, and much more different in a baby, in case of a children less than 1 year. So now there is a new update on Glasgow Coma Scale. So Glasgow Coma Scale, it is in 1976 was the first coma scale which was introduced. So now 2018 is uh, uh, by the same group. What they have added is they have added pupils to the GCS. So what this means is it is basically depends upon the reactivity of the pupil. So rest of the GCS is same. So if your pupil bilaterally is not related, it is nothing but for following the Hutchinson pupil. So if pupil is not reacting bilaterally, you give it a score of 2. And if the pupil is one side is not reactive, you give it a score of 1. And both the pupils are reactive, you give it a score of 0. So basically, it is just subtraction from the GCS. There is no addition. So you should remember this, just subtraction. So the maximum score still remains the same. It's 15. But the minimum score can still go up to 1 from 3. So that's the new update. Why this update? Now, the same thing I have now explained. So this is called as GCS-P score. And why this has been updated is been, so a patient who has pupillary asymmetry will have much more chance of mortality or poor prognosis compared to those whose pupil is still reactive compared to his GCS. So that's why this has been brought in. So regarding GCS, if I tell how many ever times, it won't, it's very difficult to understand everything. So I would recommend you to go to this website called glasgowcomascale.org, and you can see the video demonstration of each of the GCS. There's a lot of simulation happening there. There's lots of update which has been put up, which is not there in the book. You can definitely go and see in the website. So what are the other scoring system? So I said GCS is very easily, so GCS is very much useful because it can be easily reproducible. You can, even the junior most staff, even a staff nurse, she can also reproduce the GCS to a consultant. So that's why GCS is very much acceptable worldwide. There are other scoring systems. Many scoring systems are there, but the second one which has captured the eyes are this 4 scoring system. The 4 stands for just, it has 4 components and each has been scored 4. So the 2 components from the GCS is the same in the 4 score. That is the eye response as well as the motor response. Only the 2 there is no verbal response here. There is instead of that, there is brainstem reflexes and the respiration. Now this is very difficult for a junior staff or a staff nurse to reproduce because you need to check the brainstem reflexes, which you need to attain some knowledge before going to it. You need to have it requires some learning skill before understanding this 4 score system. But if this 4 score system is being followed, this has a high sensitivity to pick up and to prognosticate the patient compared to those of GCS. So though this is not so popular, though this is very much sensitive. So in a GCS, to check a motor response, you could be asked this question: where would you give this pain? So you remember only 3 sites we give. One is the fingertip pressure. Next is you can give a trapezius pinch, and next is the supraorbital notch. This is only the 3 places. It's not the sternum. A lot of people I have seen, neurosurgeons or the residents itself, they give pain to the sternum as well as the nipple. That is not the site. It is only this 3 site. You have to fingertip pressure because you can assess each limb. Any weakness is there, you can easily assess. So you need a fingertip pressure. Supraorbital notch is a central pain. You just give it and you can observe the GCS. And trapezius pinch is the alternate site for that. So the most of the confusion is between flexion withdrawal as well as abnormal flexion. So you remember one flexion and you forget the rest flexion. So that's how you should remember this. So you should remember this abnormal flexion. So that's very easy. Whenever a patient has a slow stereotyped motion and he takes the arms to the chest and he lifts his wrist like this and he keeps to the chest, this is the typical stereotyped movement that you observe in case on M3 score and M3 score. Yeah. And the normal flexion is nothing but the arms will go out. You will be giving pain. He will not be localizing. The arms will go out of the site where you give the pain. So that's scored as M4. So this is only the 2 problem. The rest of the thing is easy. M2 is global extension and M5 is nothing but he just brings the hand or the limbs to the site of the pain. Now, this is a third question. This is on diffuse axonal injury. Okay, which of the following corresponds to grade 2 diffuse axonal injury? Now, it could be option A is diffuse lesion with a focal lesion in the corpus callosum. You have a diffuse lesion with a focal lesion in the brainstem. You have diffuse lesion with a focal lesion in diencephalon, and you have a diffuse lesion alone.
Sir, I think it's A, diffuse with focal lesion in corpus callosum.
Okay, that's right. So, one thing about the head injury is the diffuse axonal injury is a recent advanced diagnosis. So basically, initially, we used to diagnose all the EDH, SDH, everything used to be it was priorly discovered. This entity was almost in late 90s. It was discovered. There's something called as diffuse axonal injury. Now, this is not as a result of a neuropathological work done by Adams et al. So he has basically classified diffuse axonal injury based on postmortem analysis. So based on the postmortem analysis, what he has found is whenever you have a diffuse lesion around the cortex at the gray white matter junction, which I'll come about to, why it happens there. So that is graded as 1. In addition to 1, there is a hemorrhagic lesion or there are lesions on the corpus callosum, which is nothing but a white matter tract connecting the two hemispheres. That's grade 2. And you have something called as the midbrain, the rostro brainstem or the midbrain, where there is a hyperintensity. I mean, the hemorrhage is seen in the postmortem analysis. In addition to grade 1 and grade 2, it has been graded as 3. So now this has been graded based on the severity. So obviously, the grade 2, grade 3 patients are more coming to the with the autopsy rather than grade 1. So that was his end of the study. Now the same principle has been applied to the present CT as well as the MRI nowadays. So you have to first understand what is diffuse axonal injury. So this is a basic neuronal structure. You have a cell body here, you have a axons, which is nothing but like a wires, and you have a dendrites here, which will synapse with other neuron and forms the circuit. So basically, the white matter is nothing but it's sheets of axons, and the gray matter is nothing but the sheets of the neurons. So during a head injury, in case of high velocity injury, there is acceleration as well as the deacceleration to the head. That produces inertia at this site, just below the neuron and the axon, just in between the axon, or else at the level of neuron as well as axon, and that causes shearing force, and that causes rupture of the axon. So this entity was later only discovered in late 90s. They used to be surprised that they used to do surgeries for those cases and find no lesion at all. That's why they did some postmortem analysis to find this kind of lesions, and later termed as called as diffuse axonal injury. So it's nothing but you have a neurons in the gray matter, you have a axons, the inertia of the force, the rotation as well as the acceleration, deacceleration occurs at the junction of the cortex, gray matter as well as the subcortical matter, that's the white matter. So you have first stretching of the axons, then there is a tearing of the axons, and ultimately it completely shears off. So when pathologically it's been seen under microscope, there's something called as the retraction balls. The axon, just like a snail, it retracts its own axons. That's how you see under the microscope. So that's one of the classical finding of a diffuse axonal injury that cannot be proved. That can be proved only in the postmortem analysis under microscope. It cannot be proved in antemortem period. So basically, then later the radiological development was there, and that's how we started identifying there's something called as diffuse axonal injury. The same principle of Adams has been formed. Now I have an example in my own institute. 2 days ago, I admitted a patient. There is a 23 years old male patient who had a history of bike into car. The patient score on arrival was E1 M5 VT. He was intubated outside in view of low GCS. Now GCS, whenever there is less than 8, the chance of aspiration is more. So you usually intubate such kind of patient. So he's been intubated outside and he's been come here. The time since injury is somewhere around 2 hours when he had come to me. So I have taken a scan. Scan was not taken outside, so I have taken a scan immediately. The scan shows this. So basically, his GCS remained the same for more than 6 hours. Okay, the classical definition of a diffuse axonal injury is there is a low GCS in spite of giving him time, at least for more than 6 hours. There is no change, there is no improvement in GCS. Is called as a diffuse axonal injury clinically. So if you carefully see the CT scan, there's no gross lesion for surgery to be performed on this case. So you remember one thing: hyperdense lesion in the CT scan contributes to calcification as well as the hemorrhage. But in case of a trauma, it more contributes to hemorrhage. I'll be talking about Hounsfield units later. So whenever you see a EDH, SDH, you just calculate the midline shape and you take him for the surgery accordingly. But if you see this scan, you just have some dot contusion here. Now this white structure is bone. You don't get confused with the hemorrhage. There's a white dot here just at the end of the sylvian fissure, and you see something in the lower cut where there's a where there is you could see some hyper intensity there in the frontal area on the left side. So this is right and this is left. So on the left side, you could see one hyperintensity, and you could definitely see a IVH, which is in the lateral ventricle, which is not seen in other ventricle, but it is seen. So what this means is the Adams principle has been brought to the CT scan. So basically, we are just finding out where the contusions are. So most commonly, it will be at the gray-white matter junction. So that's very much demonstrated in this higher cut scans, which is in the frontal area on the left side. But as the severity of diffuse axonal injury goes, it is always or sometimes it is associated with IVH as well as traumatic SH. So that's how you grade diffuse axonal radiologically. So it's almost the same as Adams, but you add two more principle to it. One is if you have a IVH with a lesion in the corpus callosum, it contributes to grade 2. If you have a IVH which corpus callosum as well as at midbrain, it contributes to grade 3. If you have a sylvian fissure bleed, same accordingly. If it is associated with the corpus callosum contusion, it's grade 2. And if it is associated with midbrain, it is grade 3. So this is how it severity. So recent studies have told clearly that you should not only look at contusions at gray-white matter, of course the white matter. You should not only look at corpus callosum, not only brainstem. You should always look in the ventricle bleed, evidence of bleed in the ventricles, and evidence of bleed in the cisterns. That's how it has been demonstrated here. Now, these are the kind of patient who don't improve much. You give him some time, 24 hours, he won't improve in GCS. So he will be staying for such a long time. So he might improve within months because of his young age, or he might be vegetative with the same response. You can't guarantee it. It again depends upon each patient to patient. You still don't know what amount of white fibers is affected, because CT scan only picks 20% of the diffuse axonal injury. Now, triple this is the one like it is been easily shown in the MRI. So only 1/3 of the injuries is being picked up in CT scan. So triple of this CT scan is it's been picked up in MRI. So MRI is slightly more sensitive in picking up this diffuse axonal injury. So that's just the magnified view where I wanted to show you. You have a IVH, you have a contusion here, you have a sylvian fissure bleed here. So everything contributes to the severity of the diffuse axonal injury. So it's a high severe diffuse axonal injury. So his GCS might not improve within a day's time. It will take months. So seeing this picture, you can easily prognosticate, and you can speak with the bystander, telling them it will take some time, or he might stay vegetative with this status lifelong. Now I have a similar example who was admitted 4 days ago. So this is a 45 years old male. Now this guy is a pedestrian hit by a bike. So now you should understand the prior history, and history also plays a very important role. The prior young chap had a history of RTA bike into car, means he was traveling on bike. So he has been toppled from the bike. So there is a lot of a rotational, angular, all those kind of mechanism happening there. But this is a pedestrian. He was just walking and he's been hit by a bike. this might be not that high velocity injury as compared to the previous history which I showed. So this patient had come with a score of E2M5V2. Now he has been not intubated because you can see the GCS is 9 year and he was maintaining the airway. He is not intubated. So I have just put him under observation in the ICU for 6 to 8 hours, and I have seen him improving over time. He has become E2, M6, and V4 response. So these are the kind of patients, so CT has been taken. These are the kind of patient who improves. If you see an improvement acutely within 24 hours, those are the kind of patient which you can quote them as a minimal diffuse axonal injury or a concussion. Of course, there's nothing seen on the CT scan. You have to define him at concussion. So this is the patient. You can see this whole CT scan. CT scan is absolutely normal. Just if you just microscopically see, you can find one dot contusion in the white matter tract on the right side of the temporal lobe. So this contributes to diffuse axonal type 1, and he has improved. So this is diffuse axonal type 1 injury. There's no IVH, there is no nothing, and he doesn't require a MRA. So MRA is required only for documentation purpose. It is not going to make any, it's just to prognosticate or to tell your bystanders that he has a severe injury which is not seen on the CT scan. It's just to document your injury. It's not going to help in any kind of management aspect. So the imaging of choice, whenever they ask you in the exam, you should think of two imaging of choice. One, nowadays it is the diffuser tensor imaging. I'll come back to it. And the most the MRI sequences, which is investigation of choices. One is the diffusion weighted image, where it can pick the hyperintensity spots and the gray white matter junction, all the spots which I have shown, which might be negative on the CT scan. Okay. And it can be visible on GRE, some gradient echo, and some SWI. Now, these are the sequences which detects blood, microscopic blood in the parenchyma. So it can be, this three sequences which is most important for identifying diffuse axonal injury. So if you could see this CT looks absolutely normal. I don't find any fault. Even a junior can see it's something, unless a consultant sees something wrong here, looking at his GCS. Now, if you could see this MRI, and if you could see this is a FLAIR image, it can see hyperintensity senior and some hyperintensity senior at the corpus callosum, and you can see this is all white matter. So you can see some gray, and this is gray matter. At the junction, you can see a hyperintensity. Now, the same thing, it has been projected in the diffusion weighted image, where you could definitely see the hyperintensity very well compared to this sequence. And you can see some coronal section, some hyperintensity lying here. So this is the advantage of MRI. You can really pick up the lesion. Now, this has to be done only in those patients where you don't see any improvement in the patient. Otherwise, acutely, when a patient comes to you, no need of directly sending it to MRI, because MRI takes a lot of time to screen. And moreover, the patient might be restless, he might be not cooperating. Whereas CT, a short of sedation is enough, and within 1 minute, you can finish the whole of the sequence of the CT scan. So that's how CT is very much investigation choice of the trauma still. MRI is done only when you suspect a diffuse axonal injury, and when you want to document. It is not going to make any change in your management. It's just help. It just guides you to document that this patient had a diffuse axonal injury. So this, you could see the CT scan has showed nothing. This is the SWI. This has just detected all the hemosiderin spots here. You could see all these microscopic spots in the white matter tract, and even in the rostral midbrain also you could see some temporal areas. All this white matter tract is affected. So this is nothing but a diffuse axonal injury picture. So now this is coming up in a huge way due to radiological advancements, thanks to all the radiological team. Now diffusion tensor weighting, it is nothing but a mapping of what all wires you have in the brain. All the white matter can be mapped easily with color codings. So you could see the normal fibers, which can be easily, this is all your white matter tracks connecting the hemisphere, connecting one lobe, one part of the lobe to other part of the lobe. All those projection, all those association fibers, all those fibers. So if you could see here, the fibers, some fibers are absent here, and I could see some disruption of fibers here compared to this scan. So absolutely, you could demonstrate that this patient has diffuse axonal injury. So this is just beauty, just to diagnose and just to document sake. So this is the investigation of. So whenever you've been asked a question, what is the investigation of size, you should write diffusion tensor imaging. If diffusion tensor imaging is not a, look out for a DWI, that's a diffusion weighted image, or a SWI, or the GRE. All this sequence can easily identify bleed immediately. So coming to the fourth question, this is the image-based, typical image-based question. So yeah, Varun, give it a shot. Your mic is muted.
So it's an extradural hematoma.
Correct. Yeah. So this is a biconvex hyperdensity spot, which you could say just underlying the skull you could see. Okay, this is biconvex. That's one of the classical features of extradural hemorrhage. And the next is you can see some mottled appearance here. That is called a swirl sign. Now, what is swirl sign is nothing but there's an active bleeding going on there. There's some bleeding spot which is actively happening there. No, this is not a contrast scan. This is just a plain CT. But you can indirectly identify that this EDH is going to increase. This is not going to stop. This requires surgery. Okay. So this is a typical picture of EDH where EDH is biconvex. And the second most classical feature of EDH is it has been limited by sutures. You could see somewhere here, you can't see it in this image. You have to trace it actually. So there might be a lambdoid suture here. There might be a coronal suture here. So dura is nicely packed or jammed tight with the sutures. Okay. And in between the sutures, the dura might be very much relaxed in case of young and pediatric children. So pediatric and young adults are the most commonest age group where you see EDH. Whereas in elderly, all this dura is just plastered with the inner layer of the skull. So it is not going to easily give you some way for the EDH formation. So that's why EDH is more common in younger group as well as the pediatric group, whereas SDH is common in elderly group. So that's why pediatric patient, you always has to be, you should be careful that you don't miss an EDH, which might be small to start with, and then later on it can grow. So if you could see these images, now EDH, as I shown you in this image, it is most commonest site. It's the temporoparietal site. And the most commonest bleeder is the culprit is the middle meningeal artery, which you could have studied in all your surgical textbooks. It's all the dural artery. It doesn't mean that that is the only commonest cause. Now, if you could see this is the suture here. Somewhere, some fracture might have been happened here. And underlying fracture, there's a huge collection of this bleed, hyperdensity, which has been there. And it has been almost, you could say that it is biconvex here. But when you take a sagittal section, it's not biconvex. It's almost mimics a SDH in this section. So don't get it wrong. So always look at, I don't know, like you should see, mostly axial is the one which would be given. This is a coronal view. This is a coronal view. This is a sagittal view. So sagittal view always can, the EDH patient, you can always think it can mimic a SDH. So characteristic of SDH is nothing but it will form a lens crescent shape bleed, which I'll come back to it. And there's also this posterior fossa EDH, which is very, very important because the rules slightly differ there for the surgical option. I'll come back to it later. And again, the rules for this also, it varies. So basically, so now you understand whenever you have this much big hyperdensity under the sagittal suture or somewhere here, you should always think of venous origin. Arterial origin is common. I understand it's in a temporal parieto aspect. It's whenever it is adjacent to the sinuses or in the sinus location, you should always suspect the fracture. There might be a fracture which might have created a laceration in the sinuses and causes this, which might have caused this bleed. So 85% EDH will show you the characteristic picture of biconvexity, fracture, pneumocephalus, and limited by the suture lines. And you need to be on your shoes any moment. You need to take those patients. That patient will continue to bleed, and he will drop in response. So you should definitely look after those patients compared to the SDH patient. Now, this is a SDH patient, subdural hemorrhage, where you could see easily there's a crescentic shape of bleed, which hyperintensity, which is seen. Now, the only difference between this and the EDH in terms of limitation is this bleed follows the dural leaflets. So, the dura actually in normal anatomy, it actually covers the inner aspect of the cranium and it dips inside the intramespical area as a falx. Now, when there is SDH, which is not going crossing opposite, you saw the other image, the EDH, which was crossing to the opposite side. If I could remind you this, you could see this. It has been crossing to opposite. You might be thinking this might be SDH. This is not SDH. This is extradural hemorrhage, because if it is an SDH, it won't cross this barrier, the falx, unless it has been torn, unless there's a associated EDH. So SDH is limited by the dural leaflets, and it's subdural, and SDH is a slightly more injuries to brain compared to EDH. EDH it rapidly progresses, whereas SDH mildly progresses. SDH is always associated with severe type of injury to the brain. Either it can be burst lobe contusions in the brain, or it can be in terms of a tearing of the bridging veins, which is most common in the elderly. So as the if you what happens if you leave the SDH, if you observe if you keep the patient on observation. So basically slowly the hematoma should resolve, but in some old patients or in some inabsorbable capabilities, or there might be some cascade of inflammatory cells which is due to the bleed, can initiate something called as chronic SDH, which we'll deal it later. So it also has the same classical appearance of the SDH, of course, and there might be a subacute stage where it is not as hyperdense. It's almost isodense. Iso means almost same. Isodense to the brain matter. So you can see this in a subacute state, and in chronic stage it is hypodense. So that's how the SDH has been classified as acute, subacute, and chronic SDH. Okay, now moving to the last question. Which of the following criteria on CT scan is or are the indications for treating an extradural hemorrhage surgically? Is it the clot volume you look for? Is it the clot thickness you look for? Is it the midline shift, or is it all of the above?
Sir, in this question, it's all of the above, because all three of them are looked for and all three of them exceed the value. So all of them are a criteria for surgical treatment of an EDH.
Okay, fine. Okay, it's all of the above. Correct. So, wait, my slides are not. Okay. So this is based the EDH surgical management of EDH. So you have this, the Brain Trauma Foundation, and you have various articles which have poured in the indication for EDH. So they have given much more importance to EDH compared to other kind of hemorrhages. It's not so but they are given, and specifically to EDH they are concentrated. Why? Because in all these articles they have found that volume is the single most criterion which is most important, and they found that volume more than 50 cubes are associated almost with 50% of the mortality of EDH. So whenever you have a EDH patient wheeling to your casualty or ER, you should first look at the volume. You should try to calculate the volume, and you should converse with your consultant, and then the decision can be taken it easily. Of course, the other criteria is also important, which I mean to say is anywhere thickness more than 1.5 centimeter, or the midline shift more than 5 mm, or the GCS is low. All this contributes to EDH. Now you can see that some of these hemorrhages are not like, if you have an EDH, it doesn't mean it's only the EDH. There can be an associated diffuse axonal injury, which might be hiding due to which might be masked by this EDH. So even if you treat the EDH, patient might not improve. Of course, the EDH carries the best prognosis among all the hemorrhages, and even and also carries a high mortality rate if you miss one. So time is very much important here, and you have to monitor the patient, and the time they drop, you have to take him for surgery. So EDH is also characterized by something called as lucid interval. Now what happens is the patient comes with consciousness, and he might had a transient LOC, which he will tell you. And again, he jumps back to consciousness. So this interval of transient LOC between two level of consciousness is called as lucid interval, which is just seen in 14% of the classical EDH. So this is not seen. This I in my residency probably have seen around classical lucid interval in probably around 10% of the EDH patient, not much more than that. So you should always try to calculate the volume in case of EDH. So now see, now this is a patient 1 week back on November 9th. I've seen this case. So I know that there is a EDH lying down. There is a fracture. Now this GCS is 15. Now this patient is conscious obeying. Okay. You could see a fracture here sitting here. And that fracture might have, because of that fracture, the atmospheric air has entered inside, which is like pneumocephalus. You won't get a pneumocephalus in case of HDH. Only when there's a break in the break in the diploid or the skull, there is a chance of the pneumocephalus to pop inside the surface of the brain. So and you have some convexity here. You can think it as EDH because there's a pneumocephalus here, there's an associated fracture, and you can fairly say it has not crossed the coronal suture. So limitation is there. So you can definitely say this is an EDH. Now this I have measured. If you could see, the thickness is somewhere around 2 centimeter. Okay. Now this falls under the criteria of the surgical year itself. Okay. Now next, what I go is to measure the midline shift, and in the central axis you draw a line, and the midline of the brain is denoted initially by pineal gland. That's what the initial ancient papers, CT scans, they use X-rays. They used to see the pineal gland and they determine the midline shift. But nowadays on CT scan, you can see the structures. So it is the septum pellucidum. It is the septum between the ventricles. Lateral ventricles is the point to calculate the midline shift. So from the center, you should see how much it has been deviated. So you can say it is not more than 5 mm. It's just 3.9 mm. So you would be thinking it wrong that you can treat this patient conservatively. Now, unless you see the volume of this. Now, how a volume is being calculated is nothing but there's a simple formula called as A into B into C into 0.5. Now, why that 0.5? It's nothing but the cuts given by the our CT technicians, at various level, 0.5 cut. So that's 0.5. That stands for 0.5. And A is nothing but the length, and B is nothing but the breadth, and C is nothing but you should see the amount of EDH which is being seen in the scans. So I have with me almost around, you can say, 15 sections of the scan, and you could see. So it is been divided into 3 parts. Whenever the bleed is less than 25%, you take it as score 0. Whenever the bleed is between 25% to 50%, you take it as score 0.5. And whenever there is more than 75% of the bleed you could see in that particular section, you score it as 1. So in this section, more than 75%, I could take this scan, this scan, this. So this somewhere around 6 or 7 cuts. And this is all less than 25. Less than 25, this is all less than 25. And here you could say that somewhere around 25% to somewhere around 25 to 75%. So somewhere around 7. So when you calculate A into B into C into 0.5, so I got somewhere volume around somewhere around 35 in this case. So that directly brings a surgical candidate in this case. So it is not the GCS which is important. It is not the midline shift which is important. It is, of course, the thickness can be sometimes low also, but in this it was high. It is the volume which is important, because EDH is one which forms a nice clot sitting over the dura. It slowly dissects the dura and it just compresses on the skull and causes decrease in the consciousness. So you have to be on your foots. So that's how the volume has been calculated. So that's how we operate EDH. And these were my 5 questions for today. And I hope you might have understood whatever topics I have taken today. Head trauma is not going to end here. There's a lot of topic which I need to cover on. There's ICP, there's SDH, which I have not covered, which I have covered very shortly. There's pneumocephalus, there's fractures. And there are some pediatric head injuries as well, which I need to cover. So thank you. Any doubts can be emailed to me at rahulmulund@gmail.com, or you can just WhatsApp me, or you can WhatsApp in the group provided by Assure. So thank you all. Any questions is welcome.